When a self-realized master comes into the world, Paramhansa Yogananda is the example we'll be talking about mostly today because his birthday is tomorrow. We have this season of avatars, starting with Christ and now ending the Ananda festival season with January 5th. When an avatar comes into the world, and Swami Kriyananda has explained this is certainly not anything I know from my own experience, but the way Swami explains it is the consciousness of the master is completely free. What that means is that they are not attached to anything that happens in this world, that their awareness of the divine behind the activities of this world is never wholly obscured, that they're not subject to the kind of sorrow that affects ordinary people. That doesn't mean they're not compassionate or they don't feel the painful experiences of this world. But because their consciousness is bigger than this one incarnation that they're living, those experiences are seen in proportion. That doesn't make them less intense, that's very important. In my life with Swami Kriyananda, who was not himself an avatar, but he was a free soul, I believe he was a Jivan Mukta, which is one who is freed, but there's still a little karma that's running. Swami defines it in great length, and I'm incapable of defining it clearly. You can read it in some of Swami's books. But with Swami Kriyananda, I made a serious mistake in my relationship with him that took me longer than I wish it had to understand, which was that he was very impersonal about himself. Impersonal is a very interesting word. That means that he didn't feel that everything that happened he had to attach himself to. The way it's described metaphysically, as long as we're identified with our ego, and our ego is the spark of divinity, the bubble of the divine, the Sanskrit word for it is jiva, the individual spark of spirit that is me, incarnates, creates this body, acts out its destiny through this personality, the culture, the friends, the whole condition. But the jiva becomes identified with this experience, and the fact of our infinity fades away, and the fact of our temporary inhabiting of this personality takes center stage. So the same experiences can happen to us whether or not we're deeply identified with them. But how deeply we are identified with them defines how much we are bound, how much our happiness depends on the ups and downs of this little life, how much further karma we create by our railing against fate and cursing God for not taking care of us and blaming you and demanding from you. All of this deepens our identification with the waves and makes us farther and farther away from the ocean. A soul like Swami Kriyananda, an avatar like Yogananda, he participates and he feels it just the same. But he also feels the entire ocean at the same time. I mean, if you think about things, your suffering, our suffering, is always at the degree of the proportion that this assumes in our lives. I was talking to Karpani before we came out this morning, and Karpani is in the stage of life where her parents are beginning to fail in their ability to live their own independent life, and suddenly as an adult child, she is swept up into the drama of helping her parents with that last quadrant of their life. I went through that with both my parents. It lasted about 5 or 6 years, and it was indeed an adventure. My parents lived in Los Angeles. For a while, I was virtually commuting several times a week to Los Angeles. When people reach that stage where they're losing control over so much of their lives, even the best of souls begin to fixate on small parts of it. My mother called me one morning and told me that I absolutely had to come to Los Angeles. I had classes, I had meetings, I canceled everything, I got right on the plane, I went all the way down there, I got to her house. She needed me to make an appointment with the dentist. Yeah. And in her mind, it had to be done by me, and it had to be done in person. She was not exaggerating her sense of need. Of course, I perceived it very differently, right? So it's all just a question of proportion. So in our human life, if somebody we love dies, if some relationship we're attached to dissolves, if some ambition is not fulfilled, it can loom extremely large. And even though to a master, it may look like having your daughter cancel everything and make a dentist appointment, to us it doesn't look like that at all, does it? Swami Kriyananda, because his karma was finishing, Jivan Mukta is there's no longer ego identification, and therefore there's no identification with what happens, and no more new karma is created. But nonetheless, not all the karma is dissolved, so it plays itself out. That's how Swami describes it. Master says that the Jivan Mukta could dissolve that karma at any point, but he allows it to run because it gives him a reason to keep coming back to help people. But at a certain point, he's done. Swami Kriyananda was done. This was the last time. I remember sitting with him once, talking about Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara Yuga is the age this planet is on right now, and it has some good points and some really rotten features. When a lot of stuff that happens in this world happens, I just say to myself, early Dwapara Yuga, what did you expect? You know, the planet is just not that elevated yet, and so there's a lot of dark forces hanging out here with all the bright ones. So I was sitting with Swamiji once, and I said, sir, the next time we come back, why don't we wait for Satya Yuga, for a very high, because it'll be more pleasant here, don't you think so? Swamiji, as it happens, we were talking over lunch, and he was eating a sandwich, and he'd just taken a big bite of his sandwich when I said that. Without even finishing what he had in his mouth, he said, I never intend to come back. I'm finished, like that. Later on, he said, though, but I know myself, he said. If I'm needed, I know I'll come back. I said, yes, sir, I know you will. We talked about Satya Yuga then, just by the way, in that same conversation. And he said, even in Satya Yuga, even when this planet is at its highest point spiritually, he said, it's still the material plane. He said, it's more pleasant, but it's still not God realization. And he said, in Satya Yuga, people like us are in charge. I said, so the whole planet is like one big Ananda. He said, yes. And so it's much more pleasant to live on, but still, the degree to which we are identified with our limitations, to that degree, we're bound. And so the whole art of moving through this world is not that we don't, and I was starting to say this about Swami. It took me longer to understand this than I could have been a better friend to him if I had understood it sooner. Finally, I articulated it to him. You're very impersonal about your feelings, but that doesn't mean that you don't feel things as deeply as everyone does. He just said, yes, just like that. I never took his feelings seriously for several decades. It took me a while to realize how tender his heart was and how much he was in need of sympathy and comfort. I don't mean for himself, but just for the plight of humanity. Everything is about compassion and kindness in this world, isn't it? I remember I read the history of William the Conqueror, William the Great Conqueror, and Henry, his son. Swami Kriyananda, Yogananda said that he was William the Conqueror, which is a kind of an interesting story in itself. There's a book called 2 Souls, 4 Lives, very interesting. And Swami Kriyananda was William's son, Henry, who took over after Henry died and eventually became King of England for 32 years, one of the greatest periods of peace and prosperity at that time in that country. Now, the life of a king, especially in those days, is very, very dramatic. And everything is about sons and land and power and money and who's going to take over afterwards and loyalties. It's very complicated. Swami Kriyananda, as King Henry, very carefully worked things out. He had one legitimate son, He had a number of illegitimate children and one legitimate son. He worked very, very carefully to train that son, to set him up to be his successor. Then he got all the lords in both France and England. Everybody pledged loyalty to that son. Everything was just as it was meant to be. And then the whole court had gone to France. And the whole court was coming back to England, and they were crossing the channel. There were 2 boats. And there was an entire older generation, of which Henry Kriyananda was the king. And then there was an entire younger generation, of which his son, the declared heir to whom everybody had declared loyalty, and all his contemporaries. And they got on 2 boats to cross the channel. Well, the younger generation group, and this is the actual story, they began to drink. And in their youthful enthusiasm, they began to share their wine with the crew. And the crew got drunk. And they crashed against a rock. And everyone but one was killed. An entire generation wiped out just like that. And the older boat lands, and they wait and wait and wait. And finally, this one survivor comes and tells them. The whole generation wiped out, and all that plan. I don't know whether I went down or whether I was on the land, but I believe I was there. When I read that story, I wept and I wept. And then I wrote Swami a note of condolence. It just broke my heart. The whole thing was so painful. I wrote him this note, and he called, and he said, "Oh, Asha, I appreciate the sentiment behind what you wrote." And then he said, "But you know, it was a long time ago." Just like that. But in the moment, it wasn't a long time ago. Just think. And as a result, the lineage, the kingdom was given to his daughter who didn't know how to rule, and they wouldn't accept a woman at that time, and it was decades before the country stabilized again. You know, it all just went to pieces as anticipated. But it was a long time ago. But it wasn't a long time ago when he lived it. And it's not a long time ago when we're living it now, is it? There's another factor I've been contemplating. Yogananda's life has been whitewashed to a very large extent by the official communicators of his mission, which has been Self-Realization Fellowship. Swami Kriyananda wrote a biography recently in which he talked much more about the challenges and the difficulties and the energy that it took Master to rise, and the betrayals, and this new movie, Awake, which some of you may have seen, and if you haven't, I encourage you to see it. It also gives much more of an honest picture of how Master struggled, how he faced racism, how he was accused in the courts and vilified by the magazines. And it talks about the point where he went to Mexico after his partner in the work betrayed him and sued him and took all his money and left him destitute. Master went to Mexico and basically said, "I don't know if I am coming back." You know, we think, oh, he just marched into America and he did what he did and it was always just so. Not at all. It was a struggle all the way. And on more than one occasion, in his private correspondence and in other, until recently unpublished things that he said and did, it was like, I've had it with America. This is just crazy in this country. You know, in India, when he went in 1935, 36, they begged him to stay there. He talked about sitting by the Ganges and meditating, and someone just came and poured a huge pile of rupees into his lap and promised him, "We'll build a temple, we'll take care of you, we'll do everything for you." And in America, he pays all the bills, and people are saying, "Oh, I think I'll go up to Mount Shasta. I understand that there's some spiritual beings up there." Yogananda just says, "Okay, go ahead and go." You know, this is the nature of life. Swami Kriyananda had some interesting things. This is what I was starting to say. So Yogananda's own life, his own life as it's known to us, does not include very much of a picture of his inner struggle. And that's very unfortunate, as I was saying this to Swamiji at one point, because he becomes a two-dimensional figure. And we begin to feel that if we have difficulties, we're not being loyal to Master. If we face trials, we don't have enough from him about his own journey, living in this world. The only thing he writes about himself in a public way is how he struggled over his mother's death, which is actually very interesting. You just read over it in Autobiography of a Yogi. You see, this is the same mistake that I made with Swami. We don't enter into it enough to really feel that how we are perfectly divine and perfectly human. Master's mother died when he was 10, I believe, and Master writes, "It was years before I was reconciled with God, overtaking my mother." Now think about that. I mean, just that simple statement, it was years before I was reconciled with God. And so when we find ourselves, unable in the moment to rise to the occasion, there's no reason inside of us that we should feel we are doing anything but exactly what we are meant to do. And I was thinking also this morning, there's a verse in a song. It might be "Door of My Heart," but I'm not sure which verse. Although the verse was, I don't think that's what it is. But the verse was, "Praying to God to come to me as sorrow, because in sorrow I will never forget thee." Because the necessity to escape from that suffering keeps us always focused. Strange, isn't it? How paradoxical this world really is. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says, what is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. And what is night to the worldly man is day to the yogi. Because we're trying to go someplace else. We're not trying to just burrow down and get comfortable. Let me phrase that differently. We are trying to burrow down and get comfortable. But our soul is already demanding something else of us. And what I was starting to say also, Swami Kriyananda, Master did not really describe past lives except the lives he's had as an avatar. The way Swamiji put it, he says he feels Master attained his realization a very long time ago. Master talked about being Arjuna at the time of Krishna. And Arjuna, of course, was already a great or realized soul. By the time he was William, by the time he was, I think, Ferdinand the Saint or Alfonso, I forget which one, in Spain, Master was already self-realized. So we don't hear about the cycles of time when he was striving and failing and picking himself up and moving forward, and anything like that. We can see an avatar participating in this world, but we don't see the time when he wasn't realized. It's a very important thing. I have found it very helpful to realize that Master became self-realized. Whenever it happened in time, it doesn't make any difference. And I've said this to you all before. Whatever vibration of delusion each one of us is working through, Master himself must have stood right at that very crossroad. Whatever attachment, whatever struggle, perhaps the exact details are not the same, but it's a vibration of delusion. Whether it's confinement, whether it's disappointment, whether it's betrayal, whether it's heartbreak, whether it's despair over one's own mistakes. And this is what I was thinking about Swamiji. Swamiji has passed on to us a number of different lifetimes. Mostly he's done it because he goes to some reader somewhere, a Brigu reader in India or an Agastya reader or an astrologer here. He wasn't, I don't know how exactly to say it, he didn't follow that sort of thing, but he was always very open to it. And in retrospect, I see, he would often go to some personage like that because then he would be able to tell us a story that he wouldn't have been able to just bring up on his own. And so by referencing those sources, he was able to say things that I believe he knew were true and that were helpful to us. And several of them, one of them in particular, he talks about how he was a very devoted disciple of Master. This is what Brigu said, but he argued with his guru. And then he went away from his guru. He tells about a lifetime in which he was married, in which he decided he wanted to serve God, and he left his wife, and he went and lived in the ashram for so many years. And then his wife came, and she wanted to join him in the ashram, but he had become too much of a renunciate, and he sent her back. And then later in that incarnation, and it's slightly not clear to me whether he also argued with his guru at that point, or somehow he began to be concerned, and he went back to make amends to her, but she had died. And he said that whole cycle had certain repercussions that he had to work out. And then he talked about another time, and this was a partial explanation for all that happened with Self-Realization Fellowship when they were so suspicious of his motives. And these are very esoteric stories, but I'm out here already. The antagonist he had in Self-Realization was Taramata. Taramata died. And then someone came to Swamiji, flew all the way from New York, to give a message to Swamiji that he said he had received from Taramata from the other side, and she apologized to Swamiji. And said, and then described a lifetime in which Swamiji had in fact betrayed Master and had split the ashram and taken people off, all the things that she accused him of in this life, of which he was totally innocent, but nonetheless the memory was there for her. And now she realized that she was wrong. Okay, that's the fascinating part of it. This is the part that I was thinking about. Think of the personal anguish that the memory, those kinds of memories, would create. You see, bondage to the ego is of many, many forms. And one of those forms is think of the anguish that it would create. To realize, as Swami must have realized in some lifetime, that he had been a disciple of Master, and his doubt and arrogance and who knows what had caused him to put himself against the Guru, take off and do his own thing for how long? How many incarnations? And what is that cycle that runs when suddenly you realize what you've done? Swami's play, The Jewel in the Lotus, is exactly about that. A man who turned against his guru and then realized his error and then spent lifetimes compensating. Swamiji says one of the reasons he had to teach so much in this lifetime, he just had to make it up. Make up for that doubt, make up for that misunderstanding. But think of the personal anguish. Now the reason to think about that is because we will go through it. And so many things that Swami did, you wonder, why is he always talking about that? And he would often talk about, oh yes, then I was in Sabbakalpa Samadhi, but I argued with my guru and I went off for a time. And he just says it like that. I argued with my guru and went off for a time. But I'm sure he wasn't always that free. But he became that free. And my heart broke because Henry's son drowned, stupidly drowned. And Swami said, yes, Asha, it was a tragedy, but it was a long time ago. And you see, the truth is, whatever is making us miserable right now will be a long time ago. The moment will come when it's all gone back to zero. The anguish, the despair, the disappointment, the attachment, the tears, it'll all go back to zero. In a very light way, Swami would often tell us the story of going skiing. This was many years ago, driving his car up to Lake Tahoe from Ananda village on what turned out to be bald tires, hitting the brakes on a snow-covered road, and smashing the car into a Greyhound bus, which, as he pointed out, the bus was fine and his car was smashed. He said, but it's a very convenient way to have an accident because then you can just get on the bus. So they abandoned the smashed car, they got all their gear, and they got on the bus. And everybody was expressing, oh, your car is totaled, And Swami was just as cheerful as he could be. He said, well, in a week, he said, it won't make any difference to me. In a month, in a year, why waste all that time suffering? Not so easy when the heart is gripped. But nonetheless, absolutely true. Whether it's a lifetime catastrophe or a moment of irritation. After all, it will be a long time ago. Why waste all that time? God is with us as much as he ever will be in this moment now. God bless you.